A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today for the ISAS Roundtable titled India's Verdict, Deciphering the 2024 Election Results. To discuss the topic today, we are delighted to have with us the following speakers. Dr. Mukulika Banerjee, Associate Professor, Department of Anthropology, London School of Economics and Political Science, United Kingdom. Dr. Banerjee will be joining us via Zoom. Professor C. Rajamohan, Visiting Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, and non-resident Distinguished Fellow, Asia Society Policy Institute, New Delhi, India. Mr. Vinod Rai, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow, ISAS, and former Comptroller Auditor General of the Government of India. Mr. Rai will also be joining us via Zoom. Dr. Ronojoy Sen, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead of the Politics, Society and Governance Cluster at ISAS. Dr. Nilanjan Sarkar, Academic Visitor, ISAS, and Senior Fellow, Center for Policy Research, New Delhi, India. And finally, Dr. Karthik Nachiappan, Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies. This roundtable will be chaired by Associate Professor Dr. Iqbal Singh Sevia, Director of the South Asian Studies Institute, National University of Singapore. Today's roundtable will be live streamed on the ISAS Facebook page, and I shall now invite Dr. Sevia to commence the roundtable. Dr. Sevia, please.
Thank you, Raghav. Good afternoon, everybody who's joining us physically in the room, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to anyone who's joining us via live stream to whichever part of the world you are in. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, I welcome you to this roundtable entitled India's Verdict, Deciphering the 2024 Election Results. As most of us have seen from the news, more than 642 million people voted in India's election, making it the largest electoral exercise ever in the world. The results have surprised many because they've contradicted the exit polls that were unanimously pointing towards a landslide victory for the BJP. To be sure, the BJP still has the largest number of seats amongst any party in the parliament. It has won 240 seats. However, this is short of the 272 seats needed to form a government. It looks set to return to power in a coalition government and as the dominant partner in the National Democratic Alliance. Meanwhile, the opposition India coalition has won 232 seats, and the Indian National Congress is seen to have been having made a resurgence with these elections. I'm going to keep my comments very short and just point out that overall, India is poised to return to what may be described as the default setting of coalition governments. Coalition governments in themselves are not necessarily a bad thing, and I'm sure we'll be discussing that. But also India has vast experience in dealing with coalition governments. But what we can be sure of is that in the coming days, we will see a number of negotiations and also hard bargaining. But I also dare say that we will also witness continuities over the next few years as well in domains such as perhaps foreign policy and economics. And I'm not going to try and prejudge what others are going to speak. And I'll end my comments by saying that there's a lot to discuss. There are a lot of interesting facets to keep our eye on. Many parts are still moving. But I'm delighted that to put some sense to what to expect, we have a stellar cast with us. And I don't just say that because they are my friends and colleagues, but because they are some of the leading experts, scholars, and policy advisors in the world. And in the discussion, we'll be starting off with a discussion about the electoral process itself, how these elections happen, what happened, some of the key facets that we should pay attention to. We'll then move on to analyze the results of the election. And then we'll go into a discussion of the foreign policy implications and the implications in the domain of economy and even technology advancements as well. So without further ado, can I invite Mukulika, who's joining us online, to please share thoughts. So I've asked everybody to actually give a few opening comments. After that, we'll open up a discussion. So Mukulika, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for including me, inviting me to this roundtable. Excuse us if we look at our phones. I think the last 4 days we've been following news unfolding in real time. But today I just wanted to make 3 points in these opening remarks. First, that before we start talking about the details of the data that we have, and I'm looking forward to that discussion, I think this is, if we are talking about the verdict, as your event is called, this is probably a verdict of India's re-enchantment with democracy. it was an evidence. The first point is that it is really, to my mind, an election of democratic maturity of India's electorate. It's been vigilant. We've had vigilant electorate voting in this election. There has been a proper opposition, which is absolutely essential to democratic politics and a sign of its maturity. And there have been real questions raised about electoral conduct, and I'll elaborate on these in a minute. The second point about this verdict is that it also, for scholars like us, it is important to remind ourselves that you cannot explain elections without thinking about inter-electoral temporalities, which is to say, we have to study elections alongside what happens in between elections. We cannot explain the results without doing this. And the third point is that as scholars of democracy, we have said this, I have argued this in some detail in my latest book, Cultivating Democracy, that democracy really has to be studied as a combination of democratic institutions and democratic culture. And this statement, the verdict this week, has been verdict on both of these things, not simply one or the other. So let me elaborate this briefly. The first point about democratic maturity, about a vigilant electorate and electoral conduct. Sadly, I think most of us studying Indian elections in this room recognize this to be perhaps the most unfair election we have witnessed in living memory, at least. I mean, everything from the schedule, the way it was scheduled over 7 phases, going into a heat wave, the lack of enforcement of a model code of conduct, the introduction of electoral bonds, the refusal to engage with the VVPAT discussion. All of these have raised questions in a way that haven't been in recent memory about the manner in which this election was conducted. So the Indian voter was tested as never before. It was having to vote in an election where the odds in many ways of the processual aspect of elections was stacked against them. So that is why if we were to, and we've hailed this, many commentators have written their pieces already, and it's been hailed as a triumph of democracy. It has been despite these structural conditions that have been placed in the way. But quite rightly, it has been seen to be a return to normal politics, as Yogendra Yadav said, of re-democratization, as Christophe Giafrello said, and so on. There are various ways in which people are reading this verdict. The turnouts, and I've, in my book, Why India Votes, talk about turnouts a lot. Why do people vote? And this time, the turnout story is a lot more complex than we have seen in the past. They've been consistently high and rising. This time, we have seen more uneven turnout, and throughout as the elections progressed, questions have been raised about turnout figures and so on. And Nilanjan Sarkar, who I'm looking forward to listening to this later today, put out these figures this morning, which are really quite interesting, and I think the start of a very important discussion, that where his figures showed us that where the competition was tough for the BJP, where there was a real chance of challenging them, turnout figures went up. And where the BJP was likely to win, turnout figures were relatively lower. So during the elections, you will remember through April and May, the concerns expressed about falling turnout figures, and we don't even know the truth about them yet. It's too early. Where the BJP voters were staying at home and so on. In a sense, today, Neelan's figures show us that what the pattern can actually tell us. So those are my comments on that first set of observations about democratic maturity and voter vigilance. The second point, that elections and inter-elections have to be studied together, right? This was you cannot explain the 2024 verdict without remembering what happened since 2019. This was the first post-COVID election. This was the election after the PM Cares Fund was brought in, which has remained largely unaccountable. This was an election immediately after the Supreme Court ruling on electoral bonds. They have existed since 2017, but this was the first time that it became public. A lot of people thought about it because of that Supreme Court judgment and made stark the fact that one party was outspending the others at a ratio of 10-1. This was also the first election where the real bite of GST was hitting. GST was introduced in 2017. The first few months were particularly turbulent. But in the last 5 years, we have seen the impact of GST, both on what my colleague Pavitra Suryanarayan and I are working on this at the moment, and we've just conducted 5 weeks of fieldwork in India through April and May. We are calling this the unease of doing business. So in the last 5 years, people have really found what paying GST, and more than, it's not the payment so much, but the manner, the process of payment and how painful it is biting. And we need to do a lot more research on this on micro and small businesses, on what the impact on the bureaucracy, which also we were tracking quite closely. This was also an election post the CAA NRC protests. Shaheen Bagh has receded in memory, but this happened in the inter-electoral period between 2019 and 2024. And of course, there was the farmers' protests in those COVID years. So if we can find a way, and this is really an appeal as much to my colleagues who work with real numbers, if there is any way in which we can really drill down into how, say, migrant workers thrown out on the highways reacted and voted this time, how small and micro businesses voted. We know the Punjab and Haryana results and the upsets caused there against the incumbent central government as a result of the farmers' protests. So basically what one is saying is that when we look at inter-election periods, when elections are not happening, there are a lot of agitation, social mobilization, social movements. And democratic theory and social movements have always had to co-conceptualize each other. And the final set of points is about democracy and being studied as a combination of democratic institutions and democratic culture. This is, as I argue, that democratic institutions, the institutional framework is what Ambedkar called political democracy. The democratic culture is what he called economic and social democracy. The fact that we have the word fraternity in the preamble to the Constitution, it's a word that carries a huge meaning and weight. And if anything, this election has been an evidence of that fraternity is not just it is an interreligious fraternity, but it is also a fraternity which accords dignity to all. And these are issues that have come up again and again and again. So the Constitution became a player, almost an important political player in this election. And again, so many colleagues have written so vividly about this particular issue. It was about having to reflect on what democratic values are, which are part of democratic culture, really, that institutions exist to protect, that authoritarianism or cronyism are not democratic values, that coalition politics in the abstract is not a democratic value. When a voter is voting, they don't know whether the final result is going to be the production of a coalition government, as we are seeing now. But what they are definitely voting against are certain kinds of behaviors that are seen to be anti-democratic. So polarization anti-authoritarianism. These were issues that came up again and again. So democratic values, what are they in popular understandings? It is about negotiation, it's about compromise, accommodation, consultation, all the things that everyone could see was completely missing from the last government. So if there is what we are now discussing is what coalition governments do, as Iqbal said in his opening remarks, what is it that it produces? It produces a certain kind of democratic culture within democratic institutions like elected governments. And that too is a result of this election. Thank you.
Thank you, Mukhalika. I think you've highlighted some of the broader points we should bear in mind and how we should frame the way we approach elections as well. So with that, I'll move to Nilanjan.
Thank you for having me. And this is on, right? Everyone can hear me? So I think before I sort of get to my comments, I want to touch on something that, Mukhalika in some ways touched on in her comments as well. For those of us, I'm an accidental political analyst, right? My original work was something else, people who've and I still work on many other things other than elections. But since I've been in India almost a decade, I think my work is most associated with party behavior and electoral behavior. And for those of us who have been studying elections for a while and spending a lot of time in the field doing quantitative analysis of elections, there was a real crisis of faith, right? That the logic of studying elections is that it's supposed to tell you something or tell you a lot about politics in society. If we start questioning the quality of the electoral system and the average citizen starts questioning the quality of the electoral system, which was happening, then what is the point of studying elections in this way, right? And I think when we saw the exit polls, a lot of us, right, the exit polls had a massive sweep for the BJP, very unlike what any of us had observed in the field and what we did not imagine was going to happen. That was a point of reckoning where we had to think about whether this kind of analysis, these kinds of, this is called deciphering 2024 election results. You can imagine a world in which it doesn't matter how we decipher the 2024 election results. The results have come as they have. It was a very close election. And I think there's a lot there. So for the people who sort of continue thinking about this and working on it, this I think is starting to become a very valuable exercise. And as people get away from their emotions and start doing some more serious analysis over the next months, I think you're going to get a lot of rich insights from this election. So just very quickly, what happened in this election, right? So in 2014, Prime Minister Modi came to power. His party, the BJP, got 282 seats, single party majority. In 2019, the BJP upped its seats to 303. Both of these are single party majority, 272 is the majority mark. This time, many people were thinking the number might even go up from 303, but actually the BJP dropped it around 240 seats, right? And the question is what happened and why? So one observable difference in this election versus previous elections, the previous two national elections, is that Modi was a central figure, Prime Minister Modi was a central figure, and there was a national wave, right? In 2014, there was a national wave around anti-corruption. There was anti-incumbency against the Congress party. A lot of this manifested in the popularity of Prime Minister Modi. In 2019, there was conflict with Pakistan. There was the Balakot strike. Again, it was a national issue that culminated in the popularity of Prime Minister Modi that could be attributed to Prime Minister Modi. I think in the run-up to this election, many people assumed that the building of the Ram Mandir, a temple to Lord Ram in Ayodhya, would have a similar effect. But what people didn't realize is that Ram Mandir is about more than Modi, right? It's about a Hindu nationalist movement. There are many actors, including actors that Prime Minister Modi himself has sidelined. And so it's not an event that is solely attributable to Prime Minister Modi. So come to election time, the BJP even very rarely mentioned on the campaign trail. It mentioned ration. It mentioned welfare delivery. It actually downplayed Ram Mandir because the machine was geared towards what could be attributed to Prime Minister Modi, right? Now, in the absence of this kind of national wave, right, what we'd seen in the last two national elections. The election started to take on more sort of regional and local characteristics. Now, one thing that was common around what people said, you heard this in many different ways. So among the Dalit communities in Uttar Pradesh, people would talk about the constitution. In other places, people would talk about the BJP washing machine, which is the investigative agencies sort of coercing political opponents to join the BJP, right, in order to get cases dropped. In other places, they would talk about the strength of federalism. But all of these point to a common source, that the government was overstepping certain red lines, certain democratic norms. So when Mukulika just spoke about, sort of re-democratization and voters sort of voting for democracy, there will be a pushback to many of our comments that this is some high-minded liberal thinking and so on and so forth. I want to tell you that for those of us who spent a lot of time in the field, we heard comments that sounded different in different places, but that could always be attributed to a very common source, right, of a government overstepping its boundaries. In the run-up to the elections, 2 chief ministers were jailed. The accounts of the major opposition party, the Congress Party, were frozen. These are things that people saw, right? And it did have consequences. Now, very quickly, I want to make 2 or 3 points. Because I want to make sure that everyone has time to speak. So I mentioned that when you spent time on the ground, you've of course picked up a lot of local anti-incumbency, local factors. Now that happens when there aren't national issues, when you have a more sort of normal election, as Iqbal said. But there's something else that one needs to sort of think about. Since 2014, Prime Minister Modi has been engaged in a project of political centralization, not just with state institutions, not just with parliament, but within his own party. So when we think of the major faces that exist in the BJP pre-2014, Shivraj Singh Chauhan, Raman Singh, Vasundhara Raje, Sushil Modi, who has now passed away, all of them were cast aside. When we think of major faces that have now been promoted within the BJP, Himanta Biswa Sharma, Yogi Adityanath, they've all been appointed post-Modi coming to power, right? So there's been a complete cleanup of the party and sort of a different and a rejigging of the party. Now, when you engage in this kind of political centralization, it has a huge impact on your class of legislators and the party rank and file. Because all policy and party decisions are made in such a centralized fashion, the quality of legislator that comes to the fore, right? If I really care about policy, what is the point of being an MP in the BJP if it's this kind of centralization? The quality of the legislator drops. So many people would complain about the economy or they'd complain about inflation, but then they would say one other thing. They would say, and my MP never comes around. My MP does nothing, right? This is a very common thing you would hear on the ground. The point I want to make here is this kind of anti-incumbency is not just normal anti-incumbency, it's actually obliged to happen by political centralization, right? And it's something that we saw. So in the absence of a national wave, when you're not voting for Modi on a national issue, all of these factors start playing against you, and it bit more severely in certain states than others. I'm going to sort of save most of these comments for later questions, but somebody is going to ask at some point, so I'll just give 30 seconds on this. What do we expect vis-a-vis coalition formation? This is uncharted territory, right? This is an unknown. What we know of Prime Minister Modi, as I've suggested, is that he has engaged in an extraordinary level of political centralization. He did so when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, and he did so when he was Prime Minister in India, right? And he's never really had to work with a coalition. His popularity, brand Modi, is associated with a certain kind of centralization and a certain kind of decisiveness. So for him to now become an accommodating coalition sort of builder would be very unusual. The other problem that Prime Minister Modi faces by trying to sort of be more accommodationist is that to open the door to coalition partners is also to open the door to enemies within the party that he has worked so hard to sort of centralize within. So I think going forward, we're going to have some genuine questions about whether Prime Minister Modi and the team that he has built from 2014 onward can deal with building a stable coalition. If not, what kinds of enticements will be given to coalition partners so that Prime Minister Modi can continue to govern as he has? So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nilanjan. Narendra?
Thanks, Iqbal. So I think both Mukulika and Nilanjan have covered a lot of the ground that I was originally intending to cover. So I'll keep my comments fairly brief. So we are still awaiting a lot of the granular data that one analyzes when one looks at the overall result. We still don't have it as yet, but I'll just focus on some of the numbers that led to the BJP actually getting 240 seats and the opposition in the alliance getting to around 230 odd seats. So there were three critical states, and most of you in the room are probably aware. The three states that send the most number of MPs to the Indian Parliament are, of course, Uttar Pradesh with 80, Maharashtra with 48, and in West Bengal with 42. And in none of these three states, these critical states, did the BJP do well. So UP is, of course, in some ways, the common saying is the route to, the Lok Sabha leads through UP. And in the last election, the BJP had 62 seats, and most of us had anticipated that they'll probably remain at that level or maybe increase the tally by a few. But what happened was actually a precipitous drop to 35 odd seats. And in fact, the rival, the rival party in Uttar Pradesh, Samajwadi Party, the SP, actually jumped from 5 seats to 37, an extremely dramatic jump. So that, in some senses, is where the battle was lost in many ways. Maharashtra was anyway supposed to be a pretty complicated picture, and for people who don't follow India, and even for those who follow India, it was an extremely complicated scenario because you had two regional parties which split, the Shiv Sena and the Nationalist Congress Party and the NCP, and they were on opposite sides, which led to making election forecasting extremely difficult. But again, what transpired in Maharashtra was, again, a precipitous decline of the BJP's numbers as well as its allies, and a steep rise in the opposition India alliance's numbers, including the Congress. So both in UP and Maharashtra, we saw a revival of the Congress. I wouldn't call it a resurgence, but a revival of sorts for the Congress. And finally, West Bengal, the state where I come from and state which I actually visited during the election campaign, there Prime Minister Modi focused a lot of his energies. In fact, I read somewhere that West Bengal was probably the state where Prime Minister Modi held the most number of rallies, around 25 odd. But that did not pay dividends. In fact, the ground reports when I was there were suggesting a drop in the BJP seat share. And I was quite surprised when the exit polls actually predicted otherwise. But we saw in the end was that the BJP fell from 18 seats to 12 in West Bengal, and the Trinamool Congress, led by Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee, increased its seat share from 22 to 29. So in some senses, the elections were lost in these three states. The BJP had anticipated some losses in the north and the west because that's kind of maxed out in 2019. And they were hoping to make some gains elsewhere. That largely did not transpire. So it was only in the eastern state of Odisha where the BJP actually swept the election and won 20 out of 21. But elsewhere, particularly on the south, where Prime Minister Modi and the BJP had focused a lot of their energies, things did not work out as to what the BJP was anticipating. They made some gains. So in Kerala, the BJP opened its account for the first time. They won a seat in Trishul. In Tamil Nadu, they substantially increased their vote share, but were unable to win a seat. Their numbers dropped in Karnataka a bit, but in the end, they made some gains in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. But in the end, actually, the numbers that they won in 2024 this time was exactly the same as 2019. So in South India, BJP had won 29 in 2019. So the number was exactly the same this year. So there's no net gain or loss in the numbers. So that's in some way sort of explains the numbers that we are looking at. Very quick comments on the campaign. Nilanjan has already talked about the lack of a national narrative. And I think there was an anticipation that the Ram Temple would play a much more prominent role in the election campaign. But even during my limited travels in Uttar Pradesh and of course in West Bengal, it seemed that the issue had not struck a chord amongst voters, did not pay the kind of electoral dividends that the BJP had hoped for. And also broadly, there was no national narrative at play, and which meant that regional parties like the Trinamool Congress or the DMK was allowed or permitted to play up regional issues. And this I saw firsthand when I saw a little bit of the campaigning in West Bengal, where Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee was pretty much harping on schemes, welfare schemes, particularly for women, that she had put in place and other things. Whereas the BJP and Prime Minister Modi's effort was to make it more national. So that, in a sense, did not play out. I think regional and local issues, in some senses, trumped a more national narrative. And finally, we can sort of discuss this in the discussion in the Q&A session. We are, of course, looking at what Iqbal mentioned is sort of the normal pre-2014 politics, coalition era, right? That's what we've seen from the 1990s, which, as we know, is actually not such a bad thing. A lot of significant changes, including liberalization, happened in the early 90s under a coalition regime. So how, Prime Minister Modi, who's actually never had to reckon with a coalition, both in Gujarat as well as nationally, how he and the BJP deals with that is really one of the things that we need to sort of discuss looking ahead. So that we can sort of keep for the discussion thing, because if you sort of look at the composition of the coalition, the two major allies are Janata Dal United and the Telugu Desam Party. And to sort of use a Hindi phrase there, sort of Purana Khiladis in this, old veteran players in this game. And then they've been doing this since the Vajpayee era. So how they also sort of, play the coalition game is something that we really need to see in the months and years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranjay. And now we'll move on to the other major theme, which is on the impact and implications of the results of the election. So I'll start off with Raja.
Thanks, Iqbal. Thanks for inviting me for this. Let me just make 3 points on the foreign policy implications. The first one, I want to speak about India's relationship with the West, US and Europe after the elections. Second, a bit on India-China dynamic, how this might shape up after the elections. And 3, India and its neighborhood policies, how this is going to work out with a politically weakened Modi government. First question, I think, on the Indian relationship with the West. If you see last 3-4 years, the dominant public narrative in the West has been about India's democratic backsliding. That it was almost just as the BJP presumed its hegemony was there permanent. Much of the pessimists, the critics in India and abroad, fundamentally agreed with this proposition that somehow in 7 years, India's political system has been so fundamentally altered to facilitate, to perpetuate the hegemony of one party and one ideology. So all the tropes about the idea of India is finished and India is not, because all of us love the 1930s metaphors. So the full play of the 1930s Europe metaphors about India's fascism. I think all of this so thoroughly underestimated the agency of the people. The people had no agency. That it was all set. It was determined that India is now condemned to live in an authoritarian system. So I think there is a problem with this, much of this narrative that has come from the West, because it essentially underestimated 3 structural contradictions, I think, in the Indian system. There are many others. One is one of the enduring contradictions in the Indian society has been the tension between religion and caste. That we saw the full play of that in the UP and other parts of the country this time. This notion, religion has trumped caste, question of caste inequalities. I think that is what probably one of the major drivers of this election. A second contradiction, I think, is the center versus periphery, that the centralizing project which Nilanjan talked about always found resistance. I mean, from Bengal, from Tamil Nadu, from even Maharashtra, this notion that everyone was in the centralization project fundamentally ignored the rise of the regional bourgeoisie over the last many years, their interests, their stakes, the notion that these guys didn't matter and that they would simply collapse or fall into line behind the Hindu centralization project. It was again an overestimation of the BJP's potential and underestimation of the realities on the ground. And the third aspect, contradiction, I would say, is between growth and equity. Because growth produces inequity, and that we all know, the economists at least tell us that. But the fact is, there is inequality that is produced by high growth India is enjoying at this point of time. And I think that, again, was fully in play in this campaign. And I think, in a way, the Congress campaign and the opposition campaign largely played on these three themes. That one, there's caste question, which needs to be addressed. And that the religious project is actually an upper caste project. They're going to change the constitution if we give them 400 seats, and they'll take away all the benefits that the constitution had given them. And I think that had a powerful appeal. The BJP's gains with the lower caste over the last decade have been turned upside down. I think the second, that whether it was Bengal or Tamil Nadu or other places, the resistance to not only a Hindu project, but a Hindi project, the notion that you can simply impose a certain set of ideas on the rest of the region. Again, I think that provided the resistance. And then the whole campaign of Rahul Gandhi on, more welfare, more jobs, guaranteed jobs, and all the guarantees that they talked about. So I think these contradictions existed from 2014, that BJP only got about 39% of the vote in the second election. But the notion that this is fundamental, because you're unwilling to admit that there was no one willing to channelize the rest of the 61% of the population. So for the first time, when the opposition actually gets together, mobilizes on the basic contradictions of the BJP's politics, you saw the dramatic effects of that policy. So I think we've seen really a brilliant campaign, I would say, by the Congress party, and essentially waiving the constitution. And talking about inequality has produced very, very powerful effects. But of course, I'll agree with Mukulika, just formation of a coalition is not necessarily greater democratization. I mean, power sharing is an important part of it. But I think when I would just go one step beyond what Mukulika was saying, it's not just the problem with institutions. I think there's a point we don't debate enough in India, that we have passed very, very bad laws which have taken away the liberty of the individual citizens. Starting from Nehru Raj, whether it's in the name of progressive politics, whether it's in the name of socialism, whether it's in the name of fighting corruption, whether it's in the name of fighting terrorism, you created a structure of laws where ED can walk into a room, you've got 7 bottles of booze in your cupboard, I can take you to. Or did you get it? I think, but we're not merely talking about institutions, that the political culture of India as a whole, deeply in favor of statism and using state power to produce so-called positive outcomes and willingness to trample those rights. The last 2 laws passed under the Congress rule, UAPA and PMLA, I mean, unbelievable power to the state to be able to confine an individual and deny bail, which is one of the most fundamental rights of any democratic society, taking away that bail. And the courts can't do anything. We'll say the courts, or when the Congress party says institutions are being misused, ED is wrong. ED is fundamentally, do we need an ED if you have an effective enforcement of it? I think that is the deeper question, not merely saying, oh, BJP has misused these institutions. Many of them were created by the Congress. To saying, look, who has given so much power to the ED that it can walk in and take away Chief Minister into jail? Because the laws, actually, we've created laws with actually full political class supporting it. And I think winning those rights back is much bigger challenge than merely building better institutions, because the judiciary is of no use if the laws are so badly passed by the political class. But I think this is really an unfinished fight, a fight for individual rights. Shall we, as a left, in the former left, we all trashed bourgeois democracy. That actually, the fight is for basic bourgeois democratic rights, that the state cannot take you out, put you in the clink on a mere allegation and not get you a bail hearing. And I think this is really the bigger task that awaits us. So I think the change of the democratic perception, even economists now thinks Indian democracy has triumphed, which has been, economists has been a big critique. So the Western narrative that the democracy was a problem in building good relationship with India, that I think will decline. So I think you have a set of consequences for that. But operationally, the US and European policy was not defined by democracy. They were quite happy to work with Mr. Modi because market and geopolitics were key indicators for the Western engagement with India, both in the case of how to deal with China, as well as how to, how an Indian market can provide a China plus one type of opportunity. So those have not, even with a backsliding India, that would have continued. In fact, you could argue if Congress had come to power, the markets would have panicked a lot more because the fear of what they might do with their economic policy. So I think there is here, the fact is, structurally here, these two issues, I think there will be continuity. That to the extent that you can do the economic reforms and to be part of working with the US to rebalance Asia. So I would say there'll be broad continuity on that ground. On the India-China issue, already some of the Chinese media are saying, look, Modi has weakened, Americans are going to dump him. This kind of an argument. Essentially, if the Chinese sense Modi has weakened, the prospect for a political accommodation from the Chinese side will be even less. So therefore, I would say the stalemate is most likely to continue in the relationship, because there's some expectation Modi came back with a strong mandate, he would be in a position to take a fresh look and negotiate. And here, one interesting thing has happened in the inter-election period. It is the Congress party which has a super hawkish line on China. Traditionally, Congress was soft on China. But today, Congress party says, look, Modi has surrendered territory. Modi keeps quiet. He doesn't say a word about Chinese occupation of Indian territory. So in a way, already the Indian internal position has actually become harder with the Congress and BJP agreeing with each other. And that leaves little room for any government, weak or strong, to make major compromises with China on the boundary dispute. On the neighborhood issue, I mean, some of the neighboring countries have been called for the swearing-in ceremony, which is on Sunday, I believe, that you have Mauritius, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan. I mean, these are the countries that have been invited. Pakistan has not been invited. So you could argue what will be the state of India-Pakistan relationship. My sense is, since the return of Nawaz Sharif, and that I suspect there will be some kind of a back-channel dialogue. I'll be surprised if there is none. So I think the Pakistan issue is not going to be handled simply as a neighborhood issue. That has to be dealt with a far more greater sophistication and greater cooking, not by public gestures, but by actual serious conversations. And it is possible, I believe, I'm hopeful, that the threads can be picked up from 2021 ceasefire agreement, which was negotiated between Indian security establishment and the Pakistan army. That the elements there which can be picked up if the two sides want and to reorganize the relationship. The rest of the neighborhood, I mean, I think we've seen a lot of ups and downs, but I would say now I think Delhi, Congress or BJP now get used to the ups and downs in dealing with them and focus on deeper structural integration. And as the Indian economy continues to grow, India's ability to do that, irrespective of which section of the neighborhood is in power. One day it could be Yamin, one day it could be Soli, one day it could be, Moizuk. So, but the thing is really structural integration within the region has improved, has increased, and I think that will continue to unfold, providing a more sound basis for India's relationship with the neighbors.
Thank you, Raja. I think that leads us very well to Karthik's paper. And we'll go to Mr. Rai.
Great. Great. Thank you so much. So I think we've kind of talked about a lot of issues. We've covered a lot. So what I'll do is, so I work largely on foreign policy issues, but related to foreign economic policy, but also get a sense of issues like globalization, global governance. So what I'll do is maybe two things. So one is look at this election, analyze it from a broader global context. In 2024, we've had a lot of elections so far. So what does this Indian verdict, this Indian election mean when you just zoom out and try to make sense of it from a broader global context? And the second is to think a little bit more on the political economy questions, right? What is it, when we've talked about, there's been a lot of analysis on how the economy has been doing and how that's been a source of concern for the BJP and the fact that they've lost as many seats as they did.
And I'll just maybe make one more point on that, and tie that in with some of the work that I've also been doing on technology and foreign policy. So if we just zoom out a little bit and kind of look at this election from a global context, right? I think what you're seeing is that you're seeing a trend of strong nationalist leaders like Modi, like Erdogan, and like others who were considered seemingly invincible, who were really powerful, and were using nationalism, sectarianism, to mobilize their support for very narrow parochial domestic agendas, right? And over the last 6 months or so, you've been seeing them face a lot more issues, especially electorally, and because it's actually really hard being and governing this way, if anything. And the fact that these leaders have proven fallible and that these governments have been hit by difficult international and domestic economic environments show that this model, this strategy has its limits across the world, right? And some of these leaders haven't been able to mitigate the effects of some crises that they've faced over the last few years, and that's causing them increasing political trouble. But the important point here is that it's causing them to lose political support, but not lose political power entirely, right? And if you look at Turkey, you look at South Africa, and India now, and in Indonesia and Mexico to some extent, you see this playing out. Where what I'm kind of getting at is people everywhere. What citizens are saying is that, look, we want a mix of both the status quo and change, and which means that I think it will take new political coalitions. It will take new political configurations in certain jurisdictions, and possibly, as we've talked about already, lead to a politics of power sharing, a politics of more domestic and contested debate, and more openness. If anything, the election so far in 2024 across different countries, so Turkey, South Africa, India, I think what they are showing is that people are saying, look, we think you can do this job. We have confidence in you, but you need to go and figure it out by working with other parties in your own establishment, right? I think that's the broader message that I'm getting at if you look at it from a broader international political kind of view. And that, so if you look at it from that sense, I think this verdict in India may be not as much of a departure, but it should have been something that we could have expected, right? Because these are leaders and these are parties that are all facing different kinds of issues. And people are saying increasingly, look, that there's only so far that populism and nationalism can go without performance. And I think you need to focus on that going ahead. And the second point I want to kind of make is this political economy question. So for countries like India, right, which are large, populous, which are in some sort of a transitional phase economically, and there are structurally imbalanced domestically between a very big and growing services sector and a kind of dormant manufacturing sector and a weak agricultural sector, right? What that's saying is that, look, India, like some of these other countries, doesn't really have a growth model or strategy for the long term, right? And that's essentially what's shown to be of problems in this election as well. I think, at least so far, to 10 years in, this government has yet to figure out a viable long-term growth strategy for India, right? I think they've done a lot of hard work fixing the institutional framework around the economy. So issues like public finance, infrastructure, digital services, welfare, subsidies, I think they're all clearly achievements, but they are insufficient to grow the economy for the long term. And this is not something that's unique to India, right? I think a lot of countries like India are trying to figure this out. And a lot of countries are investing in industrial policies now to try and figure this out. But the key question here is, if you look at what's not happened in the last 10 years and what needs to going forward in India, is how can we make the political economy work for the long term? how can the government make the kinds of important institutional changes in the economy? So issues like state-firm relations that can facilitate production and exports across industries, right? I think there's been some success over the last year or two here in this area, but clearly there's much more demand for more. So the key question that I'm kind of thinking of and looking at is, how do we organize and optimize India's political economy for long-term economic growth? One that builds off the government's strides in setting the domestic economic framework right over the last 10 years. So again, there needs to be a lot of questions around issues like education, health, on how do we increase funding for research and development so that industry can prosper and also create more jobs. I think why is this absolutely important now? Because countries like India are facing economic challenges that I think will be greater given the kind of technological changes that are affecting their economies and societies. I think we are already moving toward a future toward an economy and a future that does not need surplus labor, right? So what does that do for India's services sector? And what does that do for India's manufacturing hopes and ambitions? I think with artificial intelligence and other kinds of innovations coming on board, which increasingly require less people, I think it's time to seriously think about what India's growth strategy and model will be, because it will have political effects. Political effects that'll be hard to control and manage, even when you have 8-9% growth rates. So these are some of the questions which I think that were central to this election, but even more so going forward over the next 5 years. I'll stop there. Next.
Thank you, Karthik. And now we'll go back to the screen for our last speaker, Mr. Rai, who's joining us. There he is.
Thanks, Iqbal.
Take him out of ISIS, but you can't take ISIS out of him. So he has ISIS.
There you are. There you are. I just wanted to establish the fact that I'm very much a part of the gathering there. But at the moment I speak to you from literally the heat of the fallout of the elections. At 42 degrees, Delhi is enjoying a really warm climate. But I must, before I get on to the implications of it, I must mention to you about two things which have really accredited themselves in this election. Number one is the Indian voter. We had kind of written him off saying all the narrative, the discourse, the centralization, the free rations, the charisma, the personality factors that was supposed to be influencing the voter has actually delivered a verdict where the winner is suffering from a flavor of setback. So to that extent, there's a checking factor. And the loser, the opposition, seems to be celebrating a victory. Now, that is what I would call the magic of the Indian voter. On the other hand, the other issue, the agency which has totally accredited itself is the EVM. If you will all recall, the electronic voting machine, much maligned, much beleaguered, and the favorite whipping boy of any losing party. Nobody has faulted the EVM in this entire election. So I think the EVM has come to stay and will not be faulted anymore. Anyway, now going forward about what is going to be the implications of it all. Number one, let me handle the political part of it first. I think we are going to see a huge shake-up in the political setup on the BJP and the RSS and the equation between the two. Because in some ways, the foot soldiers seem to have held back. Otherwise, we would never see the reverses of the kind that have been seen in UP and a sweep by the BJP in neighboring Madhya Pradesh. So there seems to have been some mismatch over there, which the BJP and the RSS will be sitting together and trying to fix. The other is that considering the fact that the BJP wanted to be having or had aspirations of getting 400 odd seats for the winning combined, and the narrative that was built up around the fact that they wanted to change the constitution or bring about changes in the constitution, I think the ruling dispensation will get down onto the ground to assuage feelings. And I say this because of the coming state level elections, which are going to follow in very critical states right away, to assuage the fact that there is no proposal or thinking or even a vision to tamper with the reservation factors that have been introduced into the constitution. But then the ruling combined their habits being what they are. I'm talking about the duo or the trio that are there in the ruling combined, which is their modus operandi has been centralization. So politically, the attempt will be, because habits die hard, so the attempt will be to try and get together a combination which will continue to listen to them. And I believe that's the, in the corridors of Delhi today, on the roads of Delhi, you pick up all kinds of speculations that are going on. If TDP and JDU bargain very hard, the message that is going around is that a dialogue has been opened by through to independents. And you might just see the JDU being totally sidelined, because the possibility of breaking the JDU 6 months hence or 3 months hence is much easier than tampering with the TDP. So the JDU, if it bargains for too many ministerial berths or post of speaker or whatever it is, they might have a problem on their hands, as is being said. Now, the other aspect is equations in Maharashtra, the political equations that have been brought around. There is already talk about the Sena, how factions in the Sena have seen the consequence of the results. And we are likely, or even we are bound to see a regrouping of forces in that. Already kind of talk has emerged about it. And we might just be seeing some regrouping of those forces. Now, what will happen is the reform agenda, which again I classify into two parts, that's political and economic. Political reform, such as the UCC, is going to have a problem going forward. Number two, the Agnivir, the entire Agnipath, the recruitment policy is also going to be reviewed. There is no two ways about that. And issues such as one nation, one poll is also likely to be in the back seat for the time being, or in the near or the medium term. I don't see it being revived in any way. Agriculture reforms, labor reforms, all those are going to be in a bit of a difficulty for the time being, because each of these will require widespread consultations where there have been none in the past. And those widespread consultations will necessarily have to be with parties which did not see eye to eye with the ruling dispensation of your, which means in the 2019-2024 portion. So projects such as, well, there was Kashi, there was Ayodhya, and the third was supposed to have been a Mathura. Now that I don't see the light of day. As far as the economic parts of the reforms are concerned, I don't see much of a slowdown there at all, because unemployment and has unemployment as well as inflation has been a part of the refrain going to the elections. To that extent, capex on infrastructure development, I don't see a slowdown over there. Earlier coalitions, for example, the 91 coalition of Narasimha Rao, they came forward with huge amount of reforms, which have been very widespread and have stood the test of time. Even the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government came forward with the insurance, pension reforms, the VAT, which was introduced in the states. So to that extent, I don't see, or there is no talk of the economic reforms which have constituted the consistent policy over the last decade slowing down. Much of the indications of that will be given in the budget, which is likely to be present on the 1st of July. So we will get all the signals then, because by that time, the ruling dispensation, the combination of political parties would have put their act together, come together, and then applied the mind in terms of what is to be pursued, what may not be pursued. So for the time being, I feel that to a large extent, the government will have to have a much more consultative or a meaningful, collaborative, participative approach. They will have no option in that. So the decisions of the like of demonetization or a lockout being ordered with 4 hours notice, I think history is not going to take place in the near future. So to that extent, I feel that possibly institutions also will see some certain degree of independence being restored. So I'll stop for the time being with these comments, and let's see what more participation is required. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rai, and thank you to the speakers for sharing their insights and their own research, but also their analysis. We have half an hour for questions, so I'm going to dispense with the tradition of me asking questions, etc., and open it straight to the floor, and then I'll try and intervene wherever I can. So the floor is open, and I already see a hand up. So Ganesh, there's a mic just coming your way.
Thank you. So thank you for the very interesting discussion. I have 2 questions. I was in Delhi last week, and then of course, it was very exciting to see the results and so on, and talk to a range of people. So first question is to the international relations experts on this panel, and I would include Iqbal in that, because so what has been the impact? What has been the impact of the huge amount of effort which Mr. Modi made in linking foreign policy and domestic policy for the first time in a very innovative manner? I'm referring to G20. I'm referring to the discourse that India will retaliate across the border. The opposition trying to leverage on the Doha Club issue vis-a-vis China. So what has been the impact of this in the outcomes of the election? Did it resonate at all with the voters at all in any part of the country? That's one question. The second question relates to the future. And the future of the BJP as the dominant party, the future of its leader, Mr. Modi as Prime Minister. So in the next few months, elections are going to take place, I think, through the year in Jharkhand, in Maharashtra, I think in early 2025, and in Haryana. And all these 3 states are likely to be, the outcomes may be, or the campaign may be more favorable to the India alliance than to the BJP. So this phase may continue for a while. So, and then we are talking about mid-25, late 2025, so the question about the future of the BJP. Is the future of the BJP and its leadership is going to be with Mr. Modi, who will be close to 75. So the party will have to come to terms with that question. Would one of you like to comment on this? Thank you.
Briefly on I think you're right that there was really a special effort to link foreign policy to domestic policy, taking it to the states, taking international meetings to the states. From what we saw from all the opinion polls before the election, during the last 5 years, that the sense India is doing well, India is on the rise, and that resonates largely well with the Indian community. That doesn't mean there's automatic kind of support for the BJP translating. But I think the feeling that India is rising, which is partly true given the economic position that India's position is rising in the international system. The only mild critic that has come from the Congress is that, look, don't go around breastfeeding about how great you are. That actually this sense of being Vishwaguru, or we're going to tell the world what to do. There's criticism within, within the political class, at least. I think this could be premature. Don't overdo this business. I mean, so I think that's one. So my sense is, since he has dealt with the world, Mr. Modi, since he's going to be one of the senior leaders in the international system today after 10 years in power, he could use, improvement of relations with, countries, further improvement with the West and others, as a way of reinforcing what some of the sagging position at home. There's that possibility. But on the downside, I would say what the Indian diaspora and growing Indian diaspora abroad, especially in the West, and the dynamic intersection between India's domestic politics and the domestic politics of the Western countries where the diaspora is acquiring a larger role. That intersection is a new element, we've seen some of the negative effects of that. But my sense is managing that is going to be a bigger challenge for a weaker government. So therefore, how do we deal with the kind of interpenetration of diaspora in the Western politics and Indian politics? So how do you manage this relationship? I think this is where I think some serious engagement with the Western governments, deep states, to be able to deal with law enforcement issues, to deal with separatism issues, I think is going to be a part of the new agenda.
Yeah, so just a point on the foreign policy and the domestic politics part. I think it, at least from the sense I've got from the numbers, it really plays well amongst the young. And the youth vote, especially, I think amongst the BJP, it's risen this year from what I kind of gathered, from 48% to like 51 or 52%. So I think India's status, India's kind of rising stature, how it behaves within global governance structures and other kind of key foreign policy areas, it does matter to a certain slice of the electorate. And my guess is they were targeting that, and they probably have numbers that suggest that this really plays well there. And they really suffered amongst the other kind of segments of the electorate to whom this didn't matter, right? I think that's the kind of that's what I'll probably take away from that. I think.
Could I just add, in the CSDS looking at the pre-poll survey actually showed that foreign policy issues were quite low down in the voters' priority. You don't have to take it as gospel truth, but that's just one finding. We might some more data in the post-poll surveys.
Since in my name was I was accused of doing something about foreign policy. So I'll just say, just to add to the comment that already made, that what we've seen, at least since 2014, is that foreign policy has become an issue that's more commonly discussed in political rallies, etc., and it's got more prominence in voting selection processes. 2019 is a classic example of one of these issues where foreign policy became something that determined at least I would say a sizable section of the votes. I'm willing to be corrected. The other thing is that it's also a selling of a particular form of foreign policy as well. There's a very muscular nationalism idea that's seeped in. So this is important. Just look at the films that are coming out in India as well. It gives you a sense of how far it's penetrated. But as Roger points out, in this election, there was an attempt to sell the G20, to sell the even anti-Pakistani policy, but it didn't seem to catch on. They don't seem to have worked. I think the issue is that this election is not a wave election, it's a normal election. And it's also a very localized election, and Ranjan mentioned as well. Those issues became more important this time around. And there was a second part to that question.
On the future, maybe I can take that. So just very quickly because domestic, linking domestic and foreign policy. So, one of the things that is difficult to analyze, right, is that there are structural breaks in political systems. So for instance, we tend to think that in the US, Ronald Reagan was the first 24/7 media president. And after that, everyone kind of had to be Bill Clinton, so on and so forth, right? The question here, there's this theory in IR about audience costs, right? To the extent to which, domestic audiences can constrain foreign policy. And we tend to all kind of think that that's ridiculous, right? I mean, there's this sort of general view of things. But at the same time, it's interesting that, in some sense, by doing this linking, you're sort of creating audience. Usually governments don't want to create domestic constraints for themselves. And so the issue that one wonders about is that if it's an if domestic audiences start caring about foreign policy, is that actually optimal for India? Because often foreign policy actors want to do certain kinds of negotiations outside of the glare of domestic publics, right? So I don't think it's there. I mean, I just want to be clear, but it's also not necessarily an optimal universe to be in, even for the BJP, right? So anyway, so there's a question about the BJP's future. So we were actually talking about this earlier today. It's a tough road for the BJP right now, and I'll tell you why. So they are at a bit of a low point. There is a succession question that will definitely rear its head 5 years from now when there's another election, assuming this government completes a full term, may come up before that. And who succeeds is an open question, right? People will be making their moves. The difficulty right now for the BJP, as I said, is that because political centralization has been the norm, what does it mean to now open up to different successors, right? Are there people who have been sidelined, let's say like a Nitin Gadkari, right? Or let's say like a Shivraj Singh Chauhan, who sort of enter back into the system and start creating factionalism within the party, right? So these are genuine questions. The second thing that people haven't been talking about so much, but it's worth mentioning. A lot of damage has actually been done to the RSS for people who are walking around North India. So Walter Anderson actually has been writing and had been writing about this, right? That Mohan Bhagwat was the first person who was leading the RSS that made an explicit political calculation to back a party and to back someone for prime minister, right? The idea that there was a soft alliance between RSS and BJP was never disagreed upon, but the RSS was much bigger than that. It was like a big conglomerate that gave party money to everybody and so on. Now, what has happened in the intervening 10 years, that some of the BJP people have gone to the RSS. There are people who have moved up the ranks of the RSS who are looking for political positions. And so you go to certain parts of North India and people don't see the BJP and RSS as separate entities, right? You see fancy houses for some RSS leaders, you see big cars, them going around in big cars. It's a big problem for the RSS, actually. So one of the bigger questions about what form the BJP takes 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road is that the relationship of the RSS by itself and the RSS and the BJP is also transforming quite a bit.
I saw him.
Hi, thank you for the discussion. I had two quick questions. Yes, I'm Pratim. I'm a doctoral candidate in Oxford, but I'm here in Singapore. My first question is for Nilanjan. How did the exit polls get it so wrong? And not just the exit polls. I think even some of the pre-poll surveys were pointing towards a Modi government coming back with a brute majority again. So since you deal with numbers, did they get it wrong in terms of methods, or was there something else that was going on? The second is for Dr. Sen. I think the memory of a parliament with coalitions has sort of faded. So going forward, how do you see the parliament getting sort of again becoming the center stage of various kinds of negotiations? So yeah, just these two questions. Thank you.
Take another round of questions as well, sir. Just
Then it's coming.
yes, Mike.
Thank you. I'm Avnish. I head the Confederation of Indian Industries office here in Singapore. But earlier on, I was working in the Society of Indian Defense Manufacturers. So we worked on many international agreements promoting defense trade. The question is that in the last 4 to 5 years, the BJP government has initiated a lot of military and technological reforms. And these reforms required a majority status, such as DPSU privatization and the reforms in the acquisition procedures. While an Agniveer was also a step in that direction. Now, the intent is, of course, for the force to be nimble and not have foot soldiers on ground. Is also related to the brigades being set up on the borders. Now, with in the current mandate, how do you see those reforms taking shape. That is one. Second is also on these lines, we have initiated defense partnership agreements with US, UK, France. Will the election result have an impact on executing those things and the result on industrial partnerships? Because we are involved in many, many things along these lines. Thank you.
Yeah. Is there another hand?
Hello, hi, I'm Varun. I'm from the Straits Times. My question is fairly straightforward. It's just what are going to be the impacts of this election in ASEAN and in Singapore? And especially in terms of like economics, is there going to be any issues with sort of how receptive India is towards capital inflows under the new government?
Okay, so the exit poll disaster. So there are of course all kinds of conspiracy theories going around. What I would say is that it's very hard to believe the conspiracy theories because exit polls in India have been so bad for so long in so many different directions that you would actually have to ascribe to the exit pollsters a level of competency that they've not yet shown to be able to do that, right? So to give an example, even in the Bihar 2020 election, they got it massively wrong, but against the BJP. So the idea that they get it massively wrong, even for one side, is not true, right? They just often get it massively wrong. Why does that happen? So one comment, which is just purely on the statistics, it is very, very hard to run an exit poll. You would want a representative sample. You need people to give you honest answers to who are you going to vote for. In places where there's a culture of fear, right? So in West Bengal, it's been true for a long time. This time when I did quite a bit of field work in Uttar Pradesh, and Uttar Pradesh has started feeling like West Bengal since Yogi Adityanath has come to power. There are a lot of people who do not answer, right? Now, so it is a known matter that exit pollsters essentially get a fair amount of non-response or non-representativeness, and then they come up with their own corrections. What corrections they're doing, what corrections they're not doing is not clear. What is very unfortunate about what the pollsters are doing is there's very little transparency as to what their data sets have, right? And what kinds of corrections they're making. One would say it's bordering on unethical to be able to swing the elector, swing moods, swing markets with that low level of transparency, right? So hopefully, if markets really are moving according to the exit polls, they've learned their lesson because nobody who actually works in the stuff gives them that level of credibility. So why would markets, right? So I would just very quickly the question about capital culture, and there are bigger experts here. I don't think the biggest constraint is from the political class. I think the biggest constraint is from the local population, concerns about social inequality, and if they bind any of the political actors in some way. When we think about the Manmohan Singh government, the UP government, it's not like they were against sort of trying to move towards a more market-friendly economy. I do think the kind of politics that has come up in the farmers' protest and some of the concerns around income inequality and social inequality may bite and may constrain political actors of every party in certain ways. I don't see any major super successful political actor taking an anti-market or anti-market friendly position.
I would say on the defense reform, I think it's really been one of the major things that's happened in the second term, and it's fascinating to see. I mean, part of the public sector units, defense units, have been corporatized, the ordnance factories. Others, there is talk about collaborations. Already today, the defense for PSUs, their stock is one of the highest. So it's kind of a complete turnaround. And I think the injection of the Indian private sector into the defense production, I think we barely touched it. I mean, I think there's huge potential. My sense is the exports promotion is going reasonably well. And my sense is how far this will go. The first indication will be whether the DRDO, the Defense Research and Development Organization, There was a Vijay Raghavan committee report which was presented calling for significant reforms of the DRDO. If you see that going through, it shows there is will that to actually continue with the defense reforms. So my sense is there'll be soon indications whether it's going to be shelved or whether it's going to be implemented. On Agniveer, it was one was what you said, I mean, not lean and mean, but also the fact that if we don't do something about Indian defense budget, it's going to break the bank. The costs of sustaining a large army, fully pensioned, that question is what drove it. But the fact is, it has produced a lot of negative reaction. Congress promises to scrap it. In the whole main recruitment grounds of where army recruitment takes place, there is a lot of resentment against it. So I think the trick will be whether they'll say we'll review, because already Nitish Kumar has already called for a review. So you review, finesse. In any case, Army was actually reviewing it. The three services were reviewing it. So they will find a way and say, look, we've looked at it. How do you reshape it? I mean, that's part of the democratic process. I mean, of consultation, modification. So I think there's room. I mean, I don't think it is completely shut one way or the other. I think on the US, UK, France defense agreements, I mean, my sense is it will continue because barring the CPIM, which has attacked these agreements as abandonment of India's independence, the Congress party has not said a word. And historically, they were skeptical, but today, my sense there is actually both the Congress and the BJP largely see working with these countries as a positive thing. And the more you have the China challenge, the criticism of the West, Western collaboration with the West on defense issues has come down. Looking from a historical sense, and the China problem, the longer it persists, there's no way of India's going to walk back from.
Before I go to Karthik, I'll just go down this way. There was a question on ASEAN as well. Do you want to take that, or should I just make a very quick comment on that? Yeah, okay. I'll just make a very quick comment. I mean, the India-ASEAN and India-Southeast Asia relations has evolved in a direction because of the geopolitical and geoeconomic realities. And these realities are going to continue. They're here to stay for a while, and I believe that there'll be much more continuity. The other thing is, as Raja has already mentioned, right? The BJP has stated policy. But even the Congress has a very similar line on these issues as well. So I don't see any fundamental change in that way. And the TDP and JDU are not going to rattle this.
Just to add one thing, I mean, when the interim budget has to be presented, I think that'll give you some good indication how much of commitment is there for reform question. But capital, I mean, I don't see any blockages for capital. And in fact, anyway, more interesting thing these days is the Indian middle class is putting money into the stock markets, and we're not tied to the Western capital flows as we were in the past.
Yeah, so on the ASEAN question, I think India's relationship with countries with whom it shares clear strategic interests will continue. So Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, there's been a lot of security cooperation there. And I suspect the motivations around that cooperation will not change. China will remain a shared concern, and that will continue. The big problem is on the economic side. India still has a massive trade deficit with the ASEAN. There seems to be no real meaningful way to deal with that sustainably from India. I think that's the long-term challenge going ahead, is how can India become much more of an effective and robust trade partner to the ASEAN going forward. I think that's the challenge which I think both countries are trying to deal with while dealing with China. So my guess is cooperation on issues like services, trade and services, fintech, digital payments, cybersecurity, the blue economy, climate change, energy, all that will continue. But trade and goods is, to me, the biggest problem, which they haven't really gotten much around. So that's a challenge. Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question on Parliament. I think what we've seen, and this is a well-known story of the last decade or so, like many institutions, Parliament too has suffered. So what I see is the ruling dispensation now has to be far more accommodative, which they haven't had to do because of the numbers. In terms of just things like legislations, which were in the last two parliaments, very, very critical, I don't ever name them, have been rammed through without much debate or deliberation. So we'll really see, I think, a revival of the committee system, which I think you'll just look at the numbers. In between 2014 to 19, I think only a quarter of the bills were being referred, that actually fell to, if I'm not wrong, around 16 or 17% between 2019 to 2024. I think we are going to see a comeback, possibly, of the committee system. But I think much of it will also depend on the way the BJP floor managers, the Minister of Parliamentary Affairs, they sort of reach out to the opposition. I think there is a final point. We could see a rise in disruptions because now you have a robust and strong opposition. But then again, that I think critically depends on how well the ruling dispensation actually manages in Parliament, how to what extent they reach out. That hasn't happened in the last 10 years, but that has to happen if Parliament has to not become dysfunctional.
I'm just going to go to Mr. Wright, give him 2 minutes to respond. He's still there.
Yeah, Iqbal, may I make an attempt on this, why the pollsters went wrong?
Yes, please.
A hypothesis which is gaining ground, and it's very interesting, is that on both the sides, which is the pollster who was going in doing the survey, as well as the voter who was giving his response, the buzzword was play safe. Which means, the pollster always makes his prediction on the basis of a range. He'll say 45 to 55. And the pollster played safe and always went to the 55. That's one. Number two, as far as the voter is concerned, the voter has now stopped indicating his mind. And he just will mention what people want to hear and where. So to that extent, these guys went wrong, and they went consistently wrong. But we need to note who are the channels of the media agencies who engage the pollsters and who owns them. Can they afford, or could they have afforded to be on the wrong side? So all these factors did play together for them to be consistently going wrong. And well, the fact that they went so badly wrong in UP is an indicator of the fact that this play safe factor played out all wrong. As regards to defense PSUs, in a large number of ways, defense is a holy cow. And to that extent, I think Raja mentioned that parties like the JDU and the TDP are not going to be messing around in those waters. To that extent, I don't think much changes will be brought about, because which are the agencies involved? Well-performing PSUs like the HAL, the BEL, or the shipyards, or whatever it is. So I don't see any change happening in that. That's my take. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rai. Just for the record, I didn't go to Mukulika because she had to leave our Zoom meeting, so I'm not sidelining her in any way or form or manner. Mr. Rai, you mentioned the terms playing safe. I thank our speakers for not playing safe, but being as objective as possible and speaking from their research and their insights. So thank you to the speakers, and thank you all for joining us today. Thank you.